Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're talking about part 2 from chapter 16, the ancient world. We're going to be talking about the Aegean Sea, the three unique cultures that are there. We're going to be talking about the Greeks, and we're also going to be talking about Roman art. So as usual, after you watch this lecture, be prepared to take the quiz. So you might want to be sure to take thorough notes and read the chapter. And if you have any questions, let me know. So I'm going to go ahead and start on PowerPoint. So this is the second part of chapter 16. We're still talking about the ancient world, and we're beginning first with three very unique cultures and civilizations that are in the area of the Aegean Sea. So what's interesting about this is the later Greeks felt that they were direct descendants, or that the cultures in the Aegean Sea were their ancestors, and they considered this, not necessarily a way of studying them from a written record, but passed down from oral legends directly from the Aegean and these earlier Greek civilizations. And they called this study archaeologia, which is a branch of our kind of modern day archaeology, which is really interesting. And modern archaeology has confirmed a lot of the beliefs that the ancient Greeks had about these earlier Aegean and Greek civilizations. So this was during the Bronze Age, so there was sculptures that were made. There was also, this was sort of war-torn area as well in Greece. If you kind of think about the area of traditional Greece in the Aegean Sea, there was a lot of warring factions in that area. So a lot of their stories, a lot of the like Homer's Odyssey that come later from the Greeks, are a lot about these stories and art about conflict. So we're going to start first in the Aegean Sea. There are three distinct civilizations. We have the Cycladic, the Minoan, and the Mycenaean, and we'll talk about each of those. And then later this influences Greek art, which we'll get into after that. So the first of the three Aegean cultures near the Aegean Sea is the Cycladic culture, and this was has some shared overlaps with Mesopotamian culture as well. And what's interesting is if you look at this sculpture here, it's really unique. And a lot of these were discovered in the 19th and the 20th century to the point where they thought that they were even fakes, that these were hoaxes, because they're very abstract or modern looking. For whatever reason, the depictions of these gods or figures had noses, sometimes ears, but no eyes or no mouth. And the reason that is there's been, if you do a careful scientific study of these really interesting heads, this one coming from the Cycladic island of Amorgos, the reason is because there was traces of paint. So as scientific study realized that these probably had eyes and mouths painted on them, and that's why they're a little bit more abstract. But that actually, these images influenced some contemporary and modern artists like Picasso and Modigliani, who based their artwork on some of these Cycladic sculptures. So this is an earlier Aegean civilization, and this is the Cycladic Islands, and these relics or artifacts were found in graves. So they have potentially religious or spiritual connotations to them as well. And you can see this one's carved out of marble. Some of these are just a few inches large, and others are about the size of a head. So I saw a few of these this summer in person at the Met Museum in New York, and they're really, really interesting as objects. They were very sought after in the 20th century. They created a black market for these being excavated and sold. So some of them are actually been faked as well. So, in terms of anthropology or archaeology, we have to be careful about the provenance or the authenticity of certain objects. But we know this one here is authentic. And look at it, this timeline is about the same time as that Nana ziggurat that was built during Mesopotamian that we looked at the first part of this chapter in the Sumerian culture. The second of these three unique island Aegean Sea civilizations is the Minoan. And the Minoan were a really interesting civilization or society. They valued women. A lot of their stories and narratives and artwork revolves around women. There was a lot of goddess worship, and a lot of what we know about the Minoans come from their written language. They had two language systems. One was called Linear A and one was called Linear B. Linear A was used mostly for their historical record or for their narrative, their storytelling, their epic works. The Linear B, however, was used for like more mathematical things, record keeping, daily inventories, and modern scholars have been able to crack the code for Linear B. In other words, we can translate things about how they perhaps practice business and trade, but we know less about their daily activities because we've not cracked the code for Linear A, which is interesting if you're thinking about linguistics or studying language. Perhaps you could be the one that cracks the code for Linear A and unlocks some of this hidden knowledge about this lost civilization. So the Minoans were a group of people on an island of Crete in the Aegean Sea. Their civilization started probably around the 7th century BCE, or rather 6,000 years BCE. And existed till about 1500 BCE. We're not sure why or how they got wiped out. Perhaps it was a volcanic eruption that wiped out their society, or maybe even warring factions from the Mycenaeans, who were a contemporary Aegean culture. But we do know that there was this flourishing of culture around 2000 BCE to about 1500 BCE. And there were huge temples that were on the island of Crete, called the Palace of Gnosis, which you can still visit to this day. Part of it's been recreated, and it's in modern day Greece. But also there was a lot of, within these palace or worship-like spaces, there was also domestic spaces that include a lot of decoration, including this fresco here. And what's interesting about this fresco, it was excavated and originally found in pieces. Sorry, let me get back to this here. And then we can, if I change the color of my pen here, we can see that there are pieces here that were found, and then later it was reconstructed. So in other words, these darker parts here were added, and this was the original. So part of this is authentic and found in pieces, shattered in rubble after the society disappeared. Like down in here, you can see this is a complete section, but all of this is sort of recreated or restored. And like parts of the bowl here are restored. These are the actual elements here. And this is fresco, so this is painting pigment directly on the wall. Remember when we learned buon fresco? The true fresco from the painting chapter. That's how this was executed. This was done on the wall. A lot of these were on floors or walls, so you could walk across this. And this is nicknamed the Toreador fresco, even though it's actually probably not a bullfight. This has been discussed, kind of theorized by modern scholars as perhaps more of just the sort of like symbolism of a ritual here. We do know, like if you look at this, there's a few figures here. We see this figure here, and a figure here. If we think this is a bullfighter, it would be interesting to see a person flipping over that bull. That would be a really dangerous activity, really active and involved. But more realistically, what this was a ritualistic ceremony, perhaps. And if you look closer at the figures, they all have long hair. That was typical of the style in Minoan culture. But some of them are pale, and one of them is darker. From the Egyptian tradition, artistically, females are represented with lighter skin, and males are represented with darker skin. This was also true in Minoan culture, so we can assume that these are two female figures and this is a male figure. So some modern scholars have theorized that this was a rite of passage for young boys becoming men, to kind of do this kind of flipping over the bull. But that said, one of the things, in addition to women being very important in Minoan culture, bulls are also very important in Minoan culture. And one of the kings was King Minos, which the name Minoan comes from. And his wife was said to have had a baby that was part man and part bull, what we call today a minotaur. Right? So it relates to this concept of how bulls were very important in Minoan culture. I think it's really interesting when you look at this image, how they choose to represent the bull and the scale of it, how stretched out it is, how elongated it is here, this dramatic pose, and then the scale of the figures jumping over it, and this nice decorative frieze ornamental painting that surrounds this fresco. And this is the second of the three Aegean civilizations. This is also part of the Minoan culture here. One of the guys that discovered the temple at Knossos was Sir Arthur Evans. He was an early archaeologist, art historian, and he discovered this like in the 1920s. Problem is, though, is he would sometimes, like this, redo things or restore things. And this one maybe is a good example of like being able to see what it looks like because they painted the image around the little pieces they found, right? We'd have less of a complete picture if you just left the small pieces as relics and didn't necessarily finish or complete the dots, right? Or connect the dots. But here is an example of where Sir Arthur Evans got a little bit out of bounds and probably created too much. So this was what he called a snake goddess, and he said he found many of these. We know part of this is authentic, so mostly what they found was this intact, this section right here. But they added the color. Part of the arm was there, part of the snake was there, but there was no head. This arm has all been added, and this head was added. So, most of what was found was down here. This cat was also excavated from the temple, but it was found separate from this figure. So to say it's a snake goddess is really presumptive and perhaps even an exaggeration. This could have been many things. She could have been holding many different things, and we don't even know what she necessarily looks like. So this is a case where I think there is a level of authenticity or ethics that's involved with archaeology and anthropology and art history, where you have to take a consideration of how the objects were found and what the context for them was and what condition they are in. In other words, you can't just assume it meant something and let's complete and fill in the little missing gaps with what we think was there, but rather make a better case by leaving those empty spaces as they are. So this is an interesting case of a really unscrupulous archaeologist here, Sir Arthur Evans, who's doing too much to an earlier relic. So the Toreador fresco from the Minoan culture shows not a bullfight, but rather, I mentioned, an acrobatic, possibly ritualistic activity. The bull was significant to Minoan culture, and then Minoans worshipped one or many female deities. The third of these Aegean civilizations was the Mycenaean. And the Mycenaean overtook likely the Minoans and later laid the groundwork for historical Greece. So this is like basically older, more ancient Greeks before Greeks kind of came to be existing the way that we can traditionally study them. Because the Mycenaean left no written record. We have no idea necessarily what they meant with their artwork. And one key distinguishing factor in their artwork and their architecture is what we call Cyclopean architecture. This is architecture created on a grand scale. So if you were to walk into this space, you'd stand about this tall right here. And this is called the Lion's Gate. So these were massive blocks. Why do we call it Cyclopean architecture? Well, the historical Greeks looked back at this using kind of their idea of anthropology, and they said there's no way that normal humans could have built this, right? It's kind of like Ancient Aliens, where people are like, I don't know how they did it, so it was probably aliens. Well, their version of that was, instead of Ancient Aliens, it was Cyclops, right? Cyclopean architecture. They're like, I don't know who did it. We can't prove that humans made it or earlier Greeks made it. There's no written record, so probably Cyclops made it, right? This mythical huge giant with one eye in the center of his forehead. And that was their way of explaining away how this would be built, because these are massive stones. And in the center here, this part of the pediment right here, are these two lions on either side of a column, on this historical column here. And they're supposed to show symmetry, harmony, but also power. This idea of, hey, you better be careful walking through here because the people who built this are very, very powerful, and this is guarded. Along this was on the way to a temple. You could walk into the gates of the city. There was the palace up here and the temple, but before you got in there, you had to enter the city and go through the gate. And so this is the Lion Gate protecting the city in Mycenae. And on either side of the walls, down this way, on the other side of the gate, there would be soldiers, men with, throwing down boulders or using bow and arrows to keep you from getting into the city. So we have this Lion's Gate as a way of marking the power, the architecture, the structure that these really advanced builders and civilization were able to create. So this is all sort of part of a preface of the later Greeks. And the Greeks, what we know about these three distinct Aegean cultures comes to us from first the Greeks and then later through archaeology. This leads us to ancient Greek, and we know that the ancient Greeks put a lot of meaning and importance in a pantheon of gods, so we know they're polytheistic, and that their gods were human-like, so they interacted with humans, and they were part man. They were like, supermen in a way. Also, from our modern democracy comes the idea of politics, and that comes from the ancient Greeks. They, in Athena, in Athens, in this political structure, leaders were appointed by the masses, right? And that there was representational government. Politics comes from the Greek word polis, meaning city-state. And there's also three distinct periods. So three distinct periods in ancient Greek culture, which we'll go through. There's archaic, which is the earliest. There's classical, which is sort of considered the high period of Greek culture and art and architecture. And then the third is Hellenistic, which usually just shows a little bit more action and drama and movement in the work. So we'll go through each of those. The first, in terms of archaic, the ancient Greeks started a tradition of vase painting. So here we see an example of what's called red figure. There was two different types of vase painting style. The first was red painting, and then the second was black painting. What's interesting about this particular vase is it tells a story. It has an element of the gods that is here interacting with humans, but this particular vase would have had a purpose, a shape to it, and each one of these vases would have a different, whether it was an amphora or a pouring vessel or a drinking vessel, they would have different shapes, and each of those shapes, a volute shape or an amphora shape, was always very consistent, and that described what you would use the vase for. And the Greeks got really good at making these vases and then also painting them. What's interesting as well as the ancient Greeks were really interested in artistic practice and production, and they valued the work of artists. So we actually can learn a lot about the individual Greek artists because they signed their vases on the bottom. So this was a particular vase maker named Euphronius, and he signed his work. and then these would be collectible. And the reason that a lot of these still exist today is because the Romans were enamored with them and bought them up like crazy. And so there really are a lot of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Greek vases from this period that still exist. So if we're thinking about ancient Greek and we're looking at the first period, this is around 600 BCE. That is the Archaic period. And look at this sculpture. This sculpture is an example of ancient Greek sculpture from the Archaic period, or also known as the earliest historical period of Greek sculpture. Does it remind you of anything? Does it remind you of sculptures that we've already seen this semester? Look at the pose, right? Look at the way that one foot, the left leg, is stepping forward from the right. Look at how the gesture, the pose, is stiff at the side. What does that remind us of? Egyptian sculptures, right? Is that a coincidence? No. The Greeks knew about the Egyptian art and architecture and sculpture, and they mimicked it. And actually, they brought in Egyptian sculptors to teach the Greek sculptors how to make work. So this is very dependent on Egyptian art. So think about how influential Egyptian art has been on the Greeks, who then influenced the Romans, who influenced the Renaissance. The whole Western history and trajectory of our history starts with the Egyptians. And what's interesting too about this, if you look at the way that the body is, you can imagine a block of marble that this is carved from, right? Imagine that this is the block here, and then the areas that are removed. It looks somewhat stiff, and it kind of stays within that block, and you can see there's a little bit of a void carved here. But yeah, it's very dependent on the Egyptian earlier predecessor of Menkaure that we saw. They borrow even the same pose and gesture and naturalism. Look at the broad shoulders. Look at the stiffness of the pose and the legs stepping forward. Very, very similar. So if you're defining and taking notes and writing about what is it that is essential about the Archaic period, well, that's the stiffness, the quality of Egyptian sculpture, and also how the figure kind of gets carved out of the block of marble, which we can see is heavily dependent on the Egyptians. The next period of Greek classical sculpture and architecture is known as the classical period. So we have archaic, we have classical, and we have Hellenistic. Classical is this really productive and detail-oriented period in classical Greek sculptures and architecture. This is a building, we talked about this earlier in the semester, and this is on top of the Acropolis. So it's interesting, the Acropolis comes from a couple of different words, akros, meaning the top, and polis, which we talked about before, meaning city-state. So it's like the city or political center on top of a hill. And this had been damaged by Assyrians who had came and fought the Greeks. And so when they left and this area had been destroyed, they rebuilt it. And this was what they built. What's interesting about this, though, is it looks like this today. And actually, it's under renovations, probably in y'all's lifetime. Maybe not mine, because I'm old. I'm getting old. You're still young. Probably in your lifetime, this will be finished. This will be completely restored. But you see these blocks down here. These are parts of the Parthenon that were up here. And this is the pediment here. And there used to be sculptures up here, but they've all been, collapsed and fallen off. This is in ruins. They're trying to put this back together. And some museums, the National Museum in London has part of the Parthenon frieze of pediment sculptures that was up there. But the reason that it's in this situation now, where it's in this state of disrepair, is because in more like the modern era of like the 13th century, when people were storing munitions in there, it exploded. So this isn't actually reflective of what it could look like. And hopefully they were able to restore it and you can see what it looks like. Remember when we talked about the idea of architecture, and we talked about harmony, and that their ratio was 6. We had a ratio of how many was in front doubled plus 1. So we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times 2. We'd have 16 this way, right? Counting this one here. This is that ratio of 1 to 1, sort of like the golden mean. During the classical period, these are actually two architects that were really interested in mathematics and engineering to create this sense of beauty and harmony and strength and solidarity. This was a temple dedicated to Athena, and it was their storehouse as well. So it was their treasury of gold, and anything that was precious was stored in there. And when you walked inside, as a typical Greek temple, there was a huge, monumental sculpture that stood about 30 feet tall to Athena on the inside, but that no longer exists. It's long since been destroyed. But we can get a sense of what this looked like by seeing recreations. Has anyone been to Nashville? Have you seen the Parthenon? That's in Nashville. You can go and tour this. It's pretty cool. It looks just like the Parthenon, much better shape though, although it's built out of cement as opposed to marble columns like we see in the front here. But inside there's actually a recreation of what this sculpture looked like that was made by Phidias. And so that leads us into the next part, and that's called Phidian style. So this is still part of the classical period, and we call the Phidian style this because Phidian, or Phidias, was the sculptor that made that really famous, monumental, huge sculpture of Athena inside of the Parthenon. And outside, some of the sculptures and balustrades and friezes Phidias also made. So we call this the Phidian style, also known as the wet style. So you can see a sense of the female form hidden beneath this drapery here. You can see a sense of how the wet fabric clings to the body. And this is really typical of Phidias and his style. So they're not nude, but they appear nude, and they have this amazing sense of depth and carving. And look at all of the movement that's in the robe itself, but also the movement that's in the body here. And this has obviously been destroyed, or part of it has been destroyed, so it's not in the best shape, but we can get a sense of what this Phidian style was, which was really popular and existed for a long time during this period of classical Greek art. The next art movement or period, so we had 3. We had the archaic, we had the classical, and the third is Hellenistic. Hellenistic relates to this period of the Greek Empire when Alexander the Great was in power. And so it was actually kind of came from the outside. You had an outside leader that conquered this area and consolidated power, took over the Athenians, but really revered this style of art and architecture. And so it was sort of like Greek art on steroids, and a return to some of the themes in classical art. And we can see this was actually Alexander the Great's sculptor. And this, though, is a Roman copy of the Greek original bronze. So it's interesting, a lot of these sculptures were originally made in bronze in Greece, but then were later melted down or destroyed as the metal became scarce, and people would reuse it for like military purposes, or for coat of arms, or money, whatever they needed. It was more valuable as a commodity than it was as art. Luckily, about the same time that these Greeks were making these sculptures, Romans were making copies of them. So here we see an example of a Greek sculpture kind of passed down to us by the Roman. And does it remind you of any sculptures that come after the Roman period? Right? You can kind of see an emphasis on movement, that's a little bit familiar to Michelangelo's David, but also Bernini's David, which we'll cover when we get to the Renaissance chapter. So it's really interesting to see how, the Egyptians influenced the Greeks influenced the Romans, and then later the Romans influenced the Renaissance artists, where they borrowed a lot of the style and the gesture. One vocabulary word that we've talked about before is contrapposto. So contrapposto means a relaxed hip, and we can see it here in this sculpture, which is called the scraper. So this is known as the scraper. And you can see the contrapposto here, the relaxed hip, and the weight on one foot and the other leg is relaxed. Remember, we call that contrapposto. This is Hellenistic sculpture. Here's another example of a Hellenistic sculpture. This is again a Roman copy of an earlier Greek sculpture, so it may have been bronze. This is the Roman marble copy, and it's of Laocoon group, which Laocoon was a famous priest who warned the Trojans about the Greeks, right? Remember the Trojan horse, and the Greeks brought this gift to the Trojans, but Laocoon was the old man who warned them and said, this seems too good to be true. Right? I don't believe this. But Poseidon was the god who favored the Greeks, so he silences Laocoon and his two kids here, and he sends this serpent to kill him, basically to silence him. So this sculpture is interesting because it's representative of Greek culture, but also it's kind of this cautionary tale, like don't be on the wrong side of war, right? You want to err on the side of being with the victors, as opposed to this is your fate if you're going to be on the losing side, right? Or if you're thinking about this politically, the Greeks as Athenians are saying, let's stand up to those forces from the outside. Or later, this influences the Romans and gives them, creative justice to say, we're stronger, we're better, and this is what other civilizations are like, and they're better off if we conquer them. It's a really interesting sculpture. It's characterized by a few things that represent Hellenistic. First of all, there's a great sense of drama. You might even say that this is melodrama because it's dark and it has this sinister undertone to it. Very dramatic pose as well. So if you're thinking about Hellenistic, usually there's drama, almost like theater. There's a lot of movement, and there is also a narrative of storytelling, right? So those three key aspects, right? And in terms of the movement here, look at how the direction of his arms here, the direction of his body that goes sort of against that, and then his two sons that are surrounding him and wrapped by this snake creates this really dynamic composition, right? So we have dramatic action, we have movement, right? And we have poses, dramatic poses, and we also have storytelling, which if you looked at this and you were an ancient Roman or an ancient Greek, you would understand immediately what this story is. This sculpture was later found during the Renaissance, and it's believed that a Renaissance artist, perhaps even Michelangelo, added some of the elements that had been broken off. So this is part recreation and part restoration by Michelangelo. And if you look at some elements in the Sistine Chapel, there's a lot of borrowing that Michelangelo did by drawing directly from these busts, and that would inspire his painting style later. So it's really interesting to see how these things get reused and recycled. It's also, interesting, this is owned by the Vatican now. So if you go and tour the Vatican Museum, which is unfortunately closed right now, as most of Italy is closed, but if you go to the Vatican Museum where the Sistine Chapel is, where Michelangelo painted his beautiful ceiling, this is on the outside of that space in the Vatican Museum. So you can be face to face with this sculpture that comes from ancient Greek Hellenistic time period. This moves us into the ancient Roman art section. This is modern day Italy, is kind of where Rome started, and where we're looking at the existence of this ancient civilization. The ancient Romans, we know, borrowed from the Greeks. They weren't real unique. They weren't real clever. They stole the Greeks' gods, renamed them. They stole their artists. They actually literally took artists from Greece, and after they conquered Greece, brought them to Rome and had them make their sculptures. That's why we see a lot of copies too at the same time. And they expanded the empire as well, so they pushed out and made a really big area that they ruled and they governed. By the time the Romans conquered the Greeks, we get much more accurate portrayals of human features, much more naturalism, and much more representational art. So as opposed to the Greeks, who went through this sort of archaic period, and then classical period, and then Hellenistic, the Romans went kind of right into that sort of classical period. They also borrowed the style of architecture, like temples, from the Greeks. So a lot of the Roman architecture looks like Greek architecture. And, if you think about Washington, D.C. today, a lot of our architecture and our federal architecture borrows from the Romans and from the Greeks. So both of these cultures were very, very influential and important to what we consider today, a cornerstone of Western civilization. So it's interesting, if you think about the Romans, there was this brief period that the Roman area was actually ruled by Etruscans. This was this unique civilization in modern day Italy, in the area of like Rome and Florence, where there was the Etruscan people. They knew of the Greeks, they traded with the Greeks, they communicated with the Greeks, and they revered Greek culture as well. So in this image here, what we see is a sarcophagus. And what is a sarcophagus? It's basically a coffin. It's a funeral storage device to keep the remains, in this case, of a couple. And what's interesting about this is we see, just like the Greeks had the symposium, usually men would eat with men, and women weren't at the symposium for Greeks. But the Etruscans had the men and the women eating together. So it's really interesting. They're depicting themselves in death as they were in life. And they're shown eating, reclining. That was the style of the day. So here they're laying underneath a blanket. And she was holding an object, likely an egg or perhaps a pomegranate, which was the symbol of eternity. And they are eating together. You can see he's kind of has this Greek-style beard. A little bit looks like the archaic period, or a little bit Egyptian looking. This is all made of clay or painted terracotta. And if you notice, it doesn't look like it's in the best shape. This was actually discovered in the 1930s in about 1,000 pieces. It was just shattered, destroyed, and just teeny tiny little pieces. And archaeologists and art historians were able to piece it back together. There's about 3 known sarcophaguses. I've actually seen this one in person. You can see this one in Rome in the Etruscan National Historical Museum. And there's another one that is in Boston. That one's carved of stone, and it's interesting because you see them from an aerial view. But they're really beautiful, interesting sarcophagi that they buried the figures together actually in their homes. And this is a way of showing what was important to them in their daily lives as well. The Etruscans also were really into beauty. We find one of the most common things that you find from the Etruscan period is carved metal bronze mirrors where women or men would look at themselves. So it kind of says something about their society. We're not quite sure how they died out, but we know that the first Roman kings were Etruscans. And then later Roman emperors came out of this tradition of Roman kings. And so the empire becomes large, it becomes very powerful. And here we see the first emperor, and that's Augustus of Prima Porta. You all know the story of Julius Caesar, right? Getting stabbed in the back. E2 Brute, right? Getting stabbed by Brutus. And the senators who were, basically conspiring against him. Well, Augustus of Prima Porta was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. So it's interesting, Julius Caesar was ousted, and then later, as Senate regained control, the first emperor of this Roman Empire was related to Julius Caesar. So what we see here is a very beautiful sculpture that was created for his wife, Livia. And this was in her villa that she had as sort of like a summer home. It's got some really interesting iconology in it, and I'll kind of walk you through that. But first, what I want to just kind of talk about is it's interesting about when we think about the aesthetics of Roman and Greek sculptures, a lot of times we have this mental image of white marble, right? And this iconic look of the marble as sort of pristine and timelessness and stoic and power. But here is what it looks like today on the left. And here's actually what it looked like back in the day, because we can study this on a microscopic level and realize that there's flecks of paint on there, right? So it looks weird, right? It's atypical, it's unusual, but this is likely how it actually looked back in the day. But there's some militaristic and also religious and power associated with this sculpture that we'll run through. Here's me, mean mugging, posing in front of the Augustus of Prima Porta. This also is in front of the Vatican, so this is part of the Vatican Museum. This is a beautiful sculpture. I want to walk you through a couple of things. First of all, he's wearing military garb. He kind of has this like toga-like robe, but he also has this chest plate or this breastplate that has on it carved some gods and military scenes on it. It's portraying him as military, powerful leader, right? First and foremost. Even though he's probably not going out into war as a soldier, he's shown as a soldier to say, trust him, he's powerful, he's a great military leader, right? So that's the first thing, how he's depicted. The second thing is, look at how his hand is outstretched, right? What does that look like he's doing? He's talking to people, he's giving them a lecture like I am right now, or he's doing some sort of oration. And that shows that he's a leader and that he can talk and people will listen to him. The third is it shows the sort of religious iconography as well. So remember, the Greek gods were passed down to the Roman gods. Well, here we see Cupid at the bottom, and you can see a little bit better here. What's he riding? What the hell is this thing? Well, it's supposed to be a dolphin. Cupid's riding his famous dolphin, and he's tugging at the sleeve of Augustus here. It's showing us that Augustus is godly appointed. He's related to Cupid. He's related to the gods. He's godly appointed. He's sort of a god among men. He was the first emperor. He was really influential. A lot of things like the Colosseum, the Parthenon that we think about happened because of Augustus and his reign and subsequent emperors. So the Colosseum is not in the book, but I think it's really emblematic and shows a really unique style of the architecture and the emphasis of their culture and what they valued. So the Colosseum was actually known as the Flavian Amphitheater, and the Colosseum is a nickname that was given to it because it was built on the site of an earlier emperor, and that's Nero's palace. And he had a palace called the Golden Palace, and it had a pond in the middle of it that was about a half mile around it. Inside of the palace itself, his mansion, and he had a huge sculpture dedicated to him that was about 2 stories tall with a huge head. And when Nero, Augustus was sort of a benevolent, easy-going, great, military leader, and people were proud of him as an emperor. Nero, not so much. They thought he was a despot. He thought he was, tyrannical. And so when he finally died, they chopped down his sculpture and cut off the head. And so it got nicknamed the Colosseum because it was at the site of this colossal sculpture. So what's the Colosseum for? Well, the Colosseum was for sporting events and naval battle recreations, military recreations. If you've ever seen Gladiator, maybe something to do while you're quarantined or in self-isolation right now, Watch the Gladiator. Great film, right? Are you not entertained? That's a great movie. You should watch that. It talks about this emphasis on these fights and these battles that are recreated. And it's fictionalized, but there are some truths to the historical kind of aspects of the fight and the lineage of the emperor and the Senate versus the military versus the emperor. And the Colosseum is really interesting because it has this kind of emphasis on Greek architecture. We can see there's 3 styles of columns if you look up close at the Colosseum. The first level has Doric, the second has Ionic, and then the third has Corinthian columns. Here's me inside of the Colosseum, mean mugging. Here's my beautiful wife, Carly. She's going to make an appearance, make a cameo in my slides. But this is what the Colosseum looks like now if you go and tour it, which is beautiful. It's amazing. But it was basically an arena where the rich and the poor and everybody gathered to see these fights and these battles. So this is kind of the part of the lineage and what they leave behind. This is in modern day Rome. So you have parts of ancient Rome, you have part of Renaissance in Rome, and you also have modern day Rome, all these different layers of history, one on top of the other. Another example of an emperor is Trajan. And one of the things that Trajan did was during a time, this is, in the 1st century, AD or CE, the Common Era. So during this period, it was kind of war-torn, and there was some conflicts in the northern part of Europe where, if you think about the extent of the Roman Empire, it was over large sections of Europe, northern part of Africa, parts of Greece. It was this really large area. So they had a lot of area to control. And part of that was the Dacians were fighting against the Romans in the north. And Trajan was the emperor that was able to finally kind of like beat them back. And this column here, called the Column of Trajan, is meant to commemorate that battle. There's some unique iconography. Here's me bringing 2 different groups. So this, you might recognize some people in here. This was the trip that we took last spring. There's Haley Cormican. You see Haley. There's Taylor Williams. A bunch of people who graduated last year. This is a group that I brought in 2015. This is the group that I brought in 2019 to see Trajan's Column and walk through all these different awesome, amazing. I love Italy. I love Rome. Y'all should go. Bucket list. It's so great. But I've taken students here to these places. And if you notice, there's some iconography that you can notice. This is different friezes that wrap all the way around the column. 125 feet tall, right? Wow. Trajan, was he compensating for something? I don't know, maybe. But it has these sculptural friezes that spin all the way around the tower, which is interesting because back in the day, they would have these funeral ceremonies and they would walk around the fire pyre. So in a way, this is a memorial to Trajan, and you can imagine spinning and rotating all the way around the column to read all of these scenes of these military battles. So this Trajan's Column, if you're thinking about what was the motivation to create this, well, it commemorates their emperor, Trajan, and it commemorates their militaristic battle and being able to conquer the Dacians. So the Roman world, under Augustus's reign, that was the first emperor, we have something called the Pax Romana, which means Roman peace. And a lot of works during this time period, like the Colosseum and the Pantheon, were constructed, not to be confused with the Parthenon. And then later, sort of the fall of the Roman Empire happens when they start to get overtaken by Goths in the north, right? And some Turks and just all these different warring factions. So I had this brilliant idea, like we're having this really tough time controlling the empire. Let's split it into 2. And there's Rome in the west, and there's under Constantine, there's Constantinople, which is Byzantium, in the east, which is modern day Greece. So they split and kind of have 2 rulers. This sets up what we talk about next, which is the ancient world leading into the age of faith. So the last emperor in Roman Empire was Constantine. And after it splits. And Constantine was the first to be a Christian emperor as well. So that marks this tradition from being pagan and polytheistic, moving to monotheistic, and the spread of the Christian faith. So this is the end of this chapter, the ancient world. We've covered all of that sort of prehistory and history, and the next lecture will be on the age of faith, and we'll talk about religious practices of Christians, Jewish populations, and also Muslims. So that's the next chapter. Remember, after this PowerPoint, the best idea is to study up on your notes, read through the chapter, and then take the quiz. I wish you good luck, stay safe, best of health to you. Signing out. Peace.